With these YouTube episodes, I won't be going into creative systems theory and its multiple patterning concepts, at least in any detail. For that, you can turn to my books, in particular the book Creative Systems Theory, or some of the longer articles in the Cultural Maturity blog, culturalmaturityblog.net. But a few particular insights from the theory help highlight the power of the kind of understanding that becomes possible with cultural maturity's cognitive reordering. For many people watching these episodes, these further reflections will not be of great interest, but others may find them of particular value. Over the years, I've drawn on a variety of images and metaphors to help communicate what cultural maturity's changes involve and just where they take us. In my early book, Necessary Wisdom, I spoke in terms of bridging polarities. We can get a long way toward a culture mature perspective by identifying an issue's underlying polar assumptions, mind versus body, leader versus follower, freedom versus constraint, and seeing if we can find larger ways of thinking about them. The term bridging can be misinterpreted. A person could imagine that the word suggests only finding agreement or compromise, but when sufficiently filled out, it provides a simple approach and one that at times can provide insight hard to recognize in other ways. The characteristic of how polar opposites in human systems relate, the fact that they reflect a predictable kind of symmetry, is key to making sense the role of polarity and how we think. Polarities tend to juxtapose some harder, more right-hand quality that is concerned most with difference, with some softer, more left-hand quality that is more concerned with connectedness, such as with war versus peace, objective versus subject, or prose versus poetry. Psychology uses language drawn from the study of myth to describe these contrasting qualities. It speaks of some qualities being more archetypally masculine and others more archetypally feminine. Some people may find the gender-linked language bothersome as today we attempt to get beyond past gender archetypes, but it proves very helpful for making sense of polarity in human systems. Of particularly important, it points toward the dynamic way that polarities relate, how they work together in ways that are ultimately procreative. This way of thinking has major implications. One is central to creative systems theory's evolutionary view of culture. An appreciation for this generative symmetry helps us understand polarity's role in developmental processes. Over the course of history, we find polarity evolving from juxtapositions that give greatest emphasis to connectedness and the archetypally feminine, as with tribal societies, to polarities where difference and the archetypally masculine has much the greater influence, as with the emphasis on materialism and competition in modern times. Creative systems theory describes how we find a similar kind of progression over the course of any kind of human generative process, be it a simple creative act, the course of individual human development, or how human relationships evolve. With cultural maturity's cognitive changes, it becomes possible to step back, step beyond thinking in polar terms, and to hold a larger, more systemic picture. What creative systems theory calls the creative function maps this progression. This approach also provides a more basic kind of conceptual insight. It helps us appreciate the workings of polarity at its most fundamental, what ultimately underlies division with specific issues. Creative systems theory makes an observation with radical implications. While we tend to think of polarity in terms of opposing positions, at its most fundamental, polarity instead juxtaposes distinction and difference on one hand with connectedness and oneness on the other. One practical implication is how it alerts us to the fact that when we confuse oneness with systemic completeness, we are quite specifically taking sides. Along with helping us conceptually in these foundational ways, an appreciation for underlying symmetry also helps us make sense of socio-political polarization, the forms that socio-political polarization takes. Commentator Chris Wallace once referred to the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States metaphorically as the mommy party and the daddy party. The observation makes at least a good general shorthand for teasing apart patterns and helps us see how ideological beliefs with regard to particular issues might take the forms that they do. Creative systems theory describes how we can divide the various ways our thinking can fall short of culturally mature understanding into three basic types of polar fallacies. It calls them separation fallacies, unity fallacies, and compromise fallacies. We can lose our way by falling off the right side of the systemic roadway, by falling off the left side, or by straddling the white line in the middle with mediocre middle thinking and the risk of being hit by traffic going both ways. The common results. Separation fallacies identify with the archetypally masculine. They equate truth with difference, with perceived fundamental distinctions such as men and women, the material and the spiritual, the intellect and the emotions, and they give greatest value to the more creatively manifest side of the pertinent polarity. Here, men, the material, and the intellect. Some common separation fallacies. We are each wholly unique individuals. Experts have the answers. Final truth is what can be rationally articulated and objectively demonstrated. Man is wholly separate from nature and has rightful dominion over her. Change is a simple product of cause and effect. Unity fallacies, on the other hand, identify with the archetypally feminine. Related unity fallacies might include, in the end, we are all one. Differences are ultimately irrelevant. The ordinary person knows best, better than leaders and institutions. Final truth is what we know from within. The task is to always live in accord with nature. Everything happens for a reason, even if that reason remains mysterious. It is all connected. Unity fallacies argue against distinction and emphasize oneness. They may claim a transcendence of polarity, but they just as much reflect polar ideology. They give their allegiance to the softer, more creatively germinal hand of creation, to the spiritual over the material, feelings over facts, the timeless over the specific. Compromise fallacies split the difference. This might seem to get us a bit closer, but if the task is culturally mature understanding, they fail just as fundamentally. A few related compromise fallacies. We are all different in our own ways, different strokes for different folks. There are lots of kinds of truth, and each has its merits. In the end, life is what we make of it. Some compromise fallacies advocate for a safe, additive middle ground. Others argue correctly for multiple options, but give us nothing to help us beyond this accurate but meager observation. They claim to address diversity, but fail to address what make differences different. Compromise fallacies take us beyond black and white, but in the end, they replace it only with shades of gray. These are shorthand concepts. For starters, no one type of fallacy is distinct from the others as the labels might suggest. For example, unity fallacies commonly carry a hidden separation fallacy, and separation fallacies similarly a hidden unity fallacy. A person who sees his own group as chosen and a conflicting group as evil succumbs to a unity fallacy with regard to his compatriots and a separation fallacy in relation to his adversaries. In addition, there are in fact many versions of each type of fallacy. Some are going to be more common with certain personality styles and specific views of the future, some with others. We can talk, for example, of multiple very different kinds of unity fallacies. We often see a particularly spiritual sort of unity fallacy with advocates of New Age or back to the land philosophies. But we also find very different unity fallacies with more fundamentalist religious beliefs that ally with family values and polarize against moral relativism and intellectual elites. Different yet are the more intellectual unity fallacies common in academic and liberal thought, which side with the underprivileged and polarize against conservatives and corporations. In my book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, I use the immigration debate as an example of an issue that today has become reflexively polarized. The language of polar fallacies helps us understand common polarized responses. We can think of the position of the political right as a separation fallacy. Build that wall. The views of the political left might seem less ideological, and they can be, but at the extreme, they can come close to suggesting that the simple fact of boundaries is a problem, an obvious unity fallacy. Note that compromise fallacy thinking that splits the difference here would get us no closer. Building half a wall or letting in half the people would provide little benefit. In the end, just as much fail to ask the larger systemic question. In the book, I use the metaphor of a cell's semi-permeable membrane to point toward a more dynamic and creative way of thinking. Semi-permeable membranes are selective and make highly nuanced distinctions based on what is most life-affirming for the cell. They're also very sensitive to context. What may be most life-affirming for one cell may be very different from what is more life-affirming for another. And similarly, what is most supportive of life is very different at different times and in different situations. The concept of polar fallacies, in another way, helps us appreciate how often the important thing is less what we think than how we think. And these differences in how we think can be deep-seated. When we encounter one of our three basic kinds of fallacies, well, what we see may be a product only of momentary misunderstanding. More often, it reflects underlying psychological cognitive pattern. If we are vulnerable to polar traps, we will tend to fall for the same general sort of trap, whatever the question we consider. When we add creative systems theory patterning notions, even at this very basic level, what I describe is not so simple, but hopefully, at least a bit, I've been able to articulate how the result fits with the idea that the task ahead is in the end a needed new common sense. Again, appreciate your questions and thoughts.